our usual section on this time H2O highlights will focus on the legislative updates to water, because the legislative session is wrapping up. I can't believe I'm saying it. I'm ready for it to be done, but we're still not there yet. But I have some interesting updates with you to share. I would like to start with two important bills, SB 7, the big water infrastructure bill, and House Joint Resolution 7, which is a constitutional amendment. So let's begin with SB 7. This is, as I said, the bill that relates to water infrastructure, and it passed by the House and was heard passed by the Senate, and once in the House. In the House side of things, it was heard with some modifications that we really like. For example, it does expand the definition of new water supply to include water and wastewater reuse. That's positive. And then it expands the Texas Water Fund eligibility to include potable water reuse projects, wastewater infrastructure projects, agricultural water conservation fund, and the economically distressed area program, which is a really important program because it has been helping so many communities across the state, and some of the communities get access to water infrastructure for the first time through this particular program. So this is a really, really awesome development. But currently, this bill, SB 7, is the action on this bill is pending. It was voted out of the House Committee on Natural Resources, so its next destination is the House floor. And here on the right, you can see the timeline of the legislative session. We will be seeing it on the House floor before, I believe, May 24th. Then the other legislation that's really important, that's enabling legislation for SB 7. For all the projects that are proposed in SB 7 to materialize, we need HJR 7, which is House Joint Resolution 7. It's a constitutional amendment that would dedicate $1 billion a year to the Texas Water Fund. And if you remember our conversations earlier in the session, or maybe you're joining us right now, early in the session we had Senate Joint Resolution 66, which is kind of like a competitor constitutional amendment. But what we didn't like about Senate Joint Resolution 66 is that it proposed the split, what's known right now as the 80-20 split. 80% would go to new water supply projects like and I mean 80% of 1 billion allocation would go to new water supply projects like seawater desalination, produced water reuse, and the Texas water conveyance system or water grid that Ken will talk about in a little bit, and 20% to everything else, meaning that only 20% is available for all the programs like infrastructure programs and so on, whatever's in SB 7, right? And that's concerning. There are plenty of reasons to be concerned about 80% of 1 billion being dedicated annually to unproven new water supply projects that are concerning in terms of funding, that are concerning in terms of equity, in terms of environmental impact, and so on. So what's happening with HJR 7 right now, it passed by the House and then it moved to the Senate. It was heard by Senate Finance last week and left pending. What happened when it was heard at Senate Finance, that Senator Charles Perry, who authored SJR 66, which is currently dead, is again insisting on the split to be included, on the 80-20 split to be included. So therefore, later in the day, you will see the some information in the chat leading you to the action alert, which contains the contact information of the senators on the Senate Finance Committee. Please feel free to give them a call. I, in fact, encourage you to give them a call and urge them to pass HJR 7 without the split. We don't need the split. And I cannot advance. Here we go. Some other important bills that I would like to share, and some of them had hearings, actually all of them. HB 3728, the bill that would require to establish salinity standards for bays and estuaries, as well as it would require TCEQ to release long-term salinity studies, was heard at the end of April by the House Committee on Culture, Recreation, and Tourism. But the action is left, the bill is left pending. That means that no action was taken. Committee didn't vote on it. And to be honest, at this point in the session, it doesn't sound optimistic. Have to be frank with you here. It's a good bill though. HB 4028 would regulate pre-production plastics. It proposes to include pre-production plastics into surface water quality standards for Texas. It also includes some discharge detection and cleanup activities. It's a good bill, but it's regulations for industry similar to HB 3728 when desalination industry was against this bill. Plastic manufacturers were against HB 4028. We had a hearing last week. We waited for that hearing for over 13 hours and this bill was left pending. But what my favorite part about preparing for that hearing was that I was able to include 278 comments from concerned Texans all across the state who were also worried about pre-production plastics. And thank you for taking action. We submitted a 16-page comment document to the legislators. And then HB 1674 would regulate PFAS in agricultural products like land application products like topsoil or biosolid-based fertilizers. It's again a good bill, which had a hearing last week, also in the House on environmental regulation, similar to the pre-production plastics bill. That hearing was after midnight and went until 3 a.m., which is hard to imagine, but yeah, that's the reality. Again, the action is pending. Since we talked about PFAS last month, I wanted to bring up HB 1730, which would require a study of PFAS on impacts on human health. It was voted out of the House on Environmental Regulation Committee, but nothing happened since, I believe, last week related to this bill. HB 29, that's an important water bill that would require water loss audits to be done by the largest utilities, 6 largest utilities in Texas. It has an enforcement component. It's off to the governor's desk right now, but just going back to the bill, the enforcement component would apply when utilities are not in compliance with the provisions of this bill, and we were concerned that it might impact the rates, the bills that ratepayers receive. And so at the Sierra Club, we developed an amendment that this bill passed with. So good job. That would include some protections for ratepayers. And finally, HB 1145, the reason it's in orange is because it's concerning. It moves the authority to permit land application of treated produced water from the Railroad Commission to TCEQ. And the reason I'm saying that we are concerned, we do support the intent of figuring out how to use produced water because Texas produces like 12 million barrels a day or something like that. That's a lot of water. If we figure out how to use it, it might help with what we're doing here in Texas. But the language of the bill we don't like as far as environmental protections for human health, and not to mention that we don't even know how to treat produced water properly. But that bill is on the governor's desk and we're keeping an eye on it, and I will keep an eye on the rulemaking for the bill once it's time for it. Okay. Okay, and some pictures with you just before I finish here. Here's on the top left corner, there's a picture with Representative Morales-Shaw on the day when she introduced, and the hearing was for 3728, the salinity standards bill. We had Ken Flippen here on the left, then Representative Morales-Shaw, then myself, then Jason and Craig. Both of them are on the call. Thanks so much for being there. Then going down, Cyrus and Craig back to us. We were waiting. We spent so many hours in that conference room last Thursday waiting for the hearing that the hearing that happened after midnight. And you can see the hearing room here. The person standing testifying there is Neil McQueen with Surfrider Foundation. And so I walked out of the Capitol at around 1 o'clock, and these are the pictures of the Capitol, spooky, empty Capitol that I wanted to share with you. It's something unusual, an unusual sight at Texas Capitol, so I thought I would share them with you. Okay, so I will not go over everything in this slide, but I would like to highlight the importance of talking to legislators about HJR 7. It's pending in the Senate Finance, so contact the committee members. That if you follow the link shared in chat, it'll take you to the phone numbers of committee members. senators on the Senate Finance and talk to them about rejecting the 80-20 split of funding. And other opportunities to engage are also in the chat. And thank you so much. I'll pass it on to Ken at this time. I feel like I'm taking too much time, but if you have any questions, we'll have the opportunity to talk some more at the end. Okay, Ken, the floor is yours.
All right. Thank you, Evgenia and Dave. My apologies that you're not able to see me on the screen tonight. I just learned last week when I had two Zoom calls that for some reason my camera is not working. So I apologize for that, but not unusual out here in the provinces. I live out in a rural area that we often have problems that can't be fixed immediately with our computers and our technology. But we'll deal with just talking about the topic. First of all, I want to just sort of present a proposed definition of a state water grid for purposes of this discussion tonight. There's no, textbook definition of what a state water grid is, and probably the only state in the United States that comes close to having something akin to a water grid of this type is the state of California, although it's not completely interconnected with regard to water. But I'm sure many of you have heard of the fact that historically Los Angeles took water from the Owens Valley in California and piped it literally across the mountains from an agricultural area to the city of Los Angeles in the early part of the 20th century to allow for the growth of Los Angeles. And there's another water project that brings water from Northern California to the Central Valley for agricultural irrigation purposes. It's sort of ironic to me after having spent so many decades at the Texas Capitol hearing legislators fume against how California does things, that some people at the Texas Capitol feel we ought to emulate California and go even farther in creating a state water grid to move water around. But my proposed definition tonight for state water grid is simply a system of pipelines and other conveyances and related facilities, plus the water supplies from reservoirs, desal plants, and any other sources that would be pumped across and around Texas to meet anticipated demands from a variety of water users, municipal, industrial, agricultural, and others in different areas of the state. And when I use the term municipal, I want you to understand I'm talking about primarily water that is treated and distributed to customers by water utilities, many of which are cities, but also water districts and some private water corporations. That's what we consider municipal. Um, in other words, a state water grid does not look like the pretty picture you see on the screen. It's a system of basically man-made equipment and facilities that would move water all around the state of Texas. So let's leave that definition up there and sort of keep that in mind. Sometimes the proposals for a state water grid in Texas have included what is known as importation of water from out of state. And we'll talk about some of those specifics. That's not necessarily part of the state water grid. We could just be talking about moving water within Texas. Sometimes it is accompanied with the idea that we need to get water from other states because we don't have enough water in Texas, supposedly. Um, the basic premise of a state water grid is that you move water from where it exists in abundant supply to areas where it does not exist in abundant supply or where it's depleting, like the Oglala Aquifer in the Texas Panhandle. So the sort of historic impetus for talking about a state water grid uh, really came in the 1950s as a result of what was known as the drought of record or historic drought of record in Texas. That was a period from 1950 roughly to 1957 where almost all of the state was in drought, with some variation in different parts of the state during those years. Um, and that particular drought really had a searing effect on people's thinking in Texas in the 1950s and 1960s, because it was a horrible time when many ranchers and farmers went out of business because there was not enough water for their crops or for their livestock. And many communities were facing water challenges as well. So I think it's important that you keep that in mind, that periods of really severe drought tend to impact upon people's thinking and perhaps lead them to make some decisions or propose solutions that, in the long term, with more sort of intellectual thought behind it, would probably not be pursued. But emotionally, it's hard to, you know, neglect feelings of concern that come when you have a very severe drought. I will say that the 1950s drought was not necessarily the worst drought that Texas has ever experienced, because what are known as tree ring studies indicate that there were even more severe and longer term droughts in Texas in the past. But in terms of recorded history, the 1950s drought is considered the historic drought of record. Although in 2010, 2011, some communities in Texas experienced maybe the worst 1 year drought they've ever had in their history. So it varies a little bit from one part of the state to another. But it was really the 1950s drought that sort of caused everybody to really start taking some action about water in a real serious way. And that really has impacted a lot of proposals since that time. I have one qualification to make what I said about the drought record of the 1950s. There was actually already concern in the 1940s about what to do about uh, water shortages in Texas in the future. And then recently elected U.S. Senator Lyndon Johnson in 1949 asked the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation, which is in the Department of Interior, to do a study of how Texas might address its water supply challenges. And the Bureau of Reclamation, or BUREC as it's called for short, came up with a study which they issued a report on about 1954, and it recommended a Gulf Coast canal that would take water from the Sabine River in far east Texas and basically ship it by canal all the way down to Corpus Christi and the Lower Rio Grande Valley. Um, that was really the first of what I would call sort of a state water grid proposal. But it doesn't get a lot of attention because in the 1960s, there was an even bigger proposal for a state water grid that really gets the most attention. And that came in the 1968 Texas Water Plan that was developed by the Texas Water Development Board that was created in 1957 in response to the drought record of the 1950s. Um, Evgeny, why don't you go ahead and put up the slide with the schematic of the 1968 water plan?
It is.
As you can see from this diagram, and I apologize, it's a little hard to read on the screen, but I'll describe what you're seeing on the screen. This 1968 Texas Water Plan envisioned that there would be water imported to Texas from literally the Mississippi River. It would be brought across Louisiana uh, and then stored temporarily in a series of reservoirs that would be built in Northeast Texas, East Texas, and then it would be shipped by what was to be known as the Trans-Texas Canal from Northeast Texas all the way over to the Texas Panhandle in Lubbock area, for example. The shaded area in the Panhandle is actually the underlying Ogallala Aquifer. And then water that was shipped over to the Panhandle would be sent through different conveyances, pipelines or canals to other parts of the Panhandle for irrigated agriculture. And as you may see, there's a little arrow that actually goes into New Mexico because there was the idea that New Mexico might want to get some of this water, maybe partner with Texas to bring it from the Mississippi River. And then water would be conveyed down to essentially the area near the Permian Basin and then all the way to El Paso. And there would be various, spurs going to San Angelo in the Rolling Plains and Abilene in the Rolling Plains as well. And then over on the south side of the state, there was another canal that would have taken water from the Sabine River Basin below Toledo Bend above Beaumont, all the way down to the Corpus Christi area, and then all the way down to the lower Rio Grande Valley, sort of a rejuvenation of the idea of the Gulf Coast Canal that the Bureau of Reclamation come up with. And then, of course, there's also the water being conveyed from Lake Amistad on the Rio Grande down to Laredo, which is something that we do have when there's water in Amistad, at least. And the water that would serve Corpus Christi, or would have served Corpus Christi, might also have been available for San Antonio. So, as you can see, at the very least, this was a very ambitious water plan. And as you might expect of an ambitious water plan, the proposed price tag was pretty high. By some estimates, and I've seen different estimates, but by some estimates, almost $9 billion in 1968 terms, which is a lot of money today and certainly was a lot of money in 1968. So what happened with the 1968 Texas Water Plan? Well, there were a lot of serious issues with the water plan, as you might imagine. Things like, well, would the states along the Mississippi River be willing to give up their water to Texas? If so, would they charge for that water? What would be the cost of bringing it across Louisiana? That was never really calculated, best I can tell. And what about eminent domain issues, water rights, environmental considerations, a whole bunch of questions. Despite all these questions, though, the Texas legislature, and you have to remember this was the 1960s, when Texans were literally shooting for the moon to land a person on the moon. So the idea of grandiose projects was not really a stretch for many people. The Texas legislature in the spring of 1969, after the 68 water plan had been released, proposed to the voters of Texas a state constitutional amendment that would have authorized over $3 billion in bonds for the Texas Water Development Board to use to finance the initial part of the 1968 Texas Water Plan. And they set the election for August of 1969, just a a few months and weeks after the end of the legislative session, which didn't give opponents much time to organize against. But um, there were opponents, and one of the most prominent opponents was the Lone Star chapter of the Sierra Club, which had only been organized about 4 years earlier in 1965, I believe, out of the Rio Grande chapter. Now, I have to say, I was not involved in the Sierra Club at that time. I was not even a Sierra Club member. I was just graduating from college at the time, soon to go to graduate school and into the Army. So I wasn't really paying attention initially to all this uh, until literally after the vote was taken on the proposed constitutional amendment. But fortunately, I think for the future of Texas, the proposed initial funding of $3 billion was defeated at the polls, but it was only defeated by a little bit over 6,000 votes. And most of the opposition came from the Houston area and from environmentalists like Sierra Club and League of Women Voters also. And I think we sort of dodged a bullet there because that really sort of set the stage for more serious consideration of other ideas for dealing with water. But the water hustlers, as they were termed at that time, easily actually came back in 1976 with a proposal for $400 million in bonds for water projects that obviously would not have funded the whole 1968 Texas Water Plan, but perhaps would have been a start for such a water grid. They did not use the term water grid at the time, but that's essentially what it was. Um, but in 1976, Sierra Club and some other groups created an umbrella opposition organization. Some would term it a front organization for Sierra Club and other environmentalists. I guess that's probably not inaccurate. It was called Citizens Against Water Taxes. And it brought together fiscal conservatives and other environmentalists and legal voters to oppose the 1976 bond proposal, which again went down to defeat. Um, Now, around that time, people sort of stopped talking about getting water directly from the Mississippi River and began looking at other, maybe more realistic, if you will, water sources like the state of Arkansas. Evgeny, would you put up the next slide about the assessment of water supplies in Arkansas? So the Texas Water Development Board in 1976 contracted with a private company to do an assessment of surface water supplies of Arkansas with some calculations of whether or not those surplus supplies could be brought for importation to Texas and then uh, moved around the state of Texas. And according to the consultants that they hired, the report indicated that actually Arkansas had a quote surplus of water. And depending upon how you calculated it or what various factors you took into consideration, that it could be as much as 43 to 71 million acre feet of water. Now, if you're not familiar with the concept of an acre foot water, that is the amount of water it would take to flood 1 acre of land to a depth of 1 foot, which calculates about 326,000 gallons of water. And it's a common measure that's used in the water world because of very large numbers we're talking about with the volume of water from groundwater sources and rivers and surface water. So 43 to 71 million acre feet of water is a hell of a lot of water. Now, um, Arkansas didn't necessarily see it that way in terms of that being surplus water to send elsewhere. But Texas certainly thought that was a viable option for Texas. And but unfortunately for the water hustlers, they didn't have any funds to pursue that water in the 1970s. So in 1981, there was a new proposal by then Speaker of the Texas House, Billy Clayton, who came from the Panhandle, from Spring Lake. And he pushed through a proposed state constitutional amendment to create a water trust fund for Texas, which inevitably came to be known as the Clayton Water Trust Fund. And it would have taken a certain amount of money from what was then a state financial surplus for the state of Texas and allocated it to the trust fund, and would have continued that, sort of uh, indefinitely, to build up a fund where you could import water from other states to Texas and build all the infrastructure that you might want for a state water grid. Although he didn't really talk about a state water grid, but that was really the intention. Well, guess what? Sierra Club and others again organized Citizens Against Water Taxes and defeated the Clayton Trust Fund proposal at the polls in November of 1981. So 3 times in a row from 1969 to 1981, the environmentalists and fiscal conservatives defeated these grandiose water funding proposals because they were considered infeasible, financially too great, had many potential environmental implications, negative impacts, and a host of other reasons as well. And that sort of put the kibosh on really a lot of the talk about water importation and the state water grid for a while. Although then Governor Bill Clements continued to push the idea of getting water from Arkansas, um, even when Arkansas legislators and public officials said, no, we're not interested in sending our water to Texas. But Clements was defeated for reelection in 1986, and the idea sort of went away, at least for the time being. And so everything was fairly quiet on the arena of a state water grid for several years until 1991, when then State Senator Bill Sims from San Angelo introduced a bill which he characterized as a very routine bill to make some administrative changes at the Water Development Board. And Senator Sims got that bill through the Senate on local and consent calendar. It went to the House, did not get any attention, passed the House fairly easily. It went to the governor's desk, Governor Richards at the time, and it became law. But hidden at the end of that bill, which many people overlooked, in fact, everybody pretty much overlooked it, including myself at the time, was a sentence that repealed part of the Texas Water Code. And what it repealed was a prohibition against the Texas Water Development Board um, using interbasin transfers to move water within Texas, unless that water was not needed in the basin of origin. In other words, the basin where the water would be brought from for the next 50 years. And once that provision of water code went away, the Texas Water Development Board later in 1991 announced that they were going to do a Trans-Texas Water Program, which was going to study the movement of water essentially from water rich parts of the state, as they described it, to water short parts of the state, which mainly meant moving from East Texas to South Texas, to Houston, to the Texas Hill Country, and that was about it. It did not envision moving water to West Texas or the Panhandle or any place west of the Hill Country. And so they began an elaborate process that lasted for about 5 years, included a lot of stakeholder committees, looking at moving water within Texas, not importing water, but moving water within Texas, primarily from the Sabine River area. Um, that got short-circuited, though, in 1997 when Senate Bill 1, a priority for then Lieutenant Governor Bob Bullock, passed. And that created the current regional water planning process. We went from having a top-down water planning process run by the Water Development Board to one that basically was at a regional level with 16 regional groups in different parts of the state coming up with regional water plans. And then eventually those regional water plans were aggregated into a state water plan. And there was no real discussion about water importation or water movement from one basin or one region to the other, with a few exceptions. So for a long time, that regional water planning process pretty much shut aside any concept about a state water grid. However, in 2015, then State Representative Lyle Larson, who chaired the House Natural Resources Committee, and then State Senator Charles Perry, who had just been elected to the Senate from the House in 2014 and became the chair of a new Senate Water Committee. They came up with a proposal to study the idea of establishing a state water grid. Again, if you go to the next slide, I believe, talks about the state water grid. So this was 2015. Larson carried the bill in the House. He passed it through the House without too much opposition. It went to the Senate, but it was late in the session, and so it did not get acted on by the Senate, and the bill died at the end of the session. But Lyle Larson and Charles Perry tried to keep the idea alive through the interim by doing interim studies that would focus on a state water grid. And this particular newspaper article from the El Paso Times is an article that came out toward the beginning of the interim when the study was about to begin. It quotes me fairly extensively on behalf of the Sierra Club against the proposed water grid. It also had some op-eds earlier in the year against the grid, which I can share with you guys at some time if you're interested. Now, for whatever reason, even though it was discussed at the beginning of the interim, the idea sort of went away. And in 2017, with Larson and Perry both back in the legislature, they never brought up the issue again. I don't know if they had gotten the opinion that it just wasn't plausible, or in the case of Perry, he sort of changed his focus for a time being to flooding issues and focused a lot of his legislation on flood management. And Lyle Larson eventually got crosswise with Governor Abbott, which sort of undermined his political career. And then he did not run for re-election in, I guess, 2022. So he was gone. So everything was quiet until 2 years ago. Chairman Perry proposed legislation to create a Texas water fund, and within it, a new water supply Texas fund that would fund things like marine desalination, seawater desalination, produced water production, offer storage and recovery, importation of water from out of state, and some other types of water projects. And he began talking again about importing water from Louisiana, in this case from Toledo Bend, the Louisiana portion of Toledo Bend. and claimed that he was, close to making a deal on that. Um, the water fund did pass the Senate, it passed the House, went to conference committee to iron out the differences. And magically, the language about out-of-state importation disappeared from the bill in conference committee, even though it was in both the House and Senate versions, which is very unusual, but can be done. And there was, Sarah Club and myself were probably the only ones really talking against the importation. So we would love to claim credit for getting that out of the bill, although I really can't imagine that we were the ones responsible for doing that. And there was even a rumor that Lieutenant Governor Patrick did not like out-of-state water importation for whatever reason. So I don't know what the real story was, but that idea got shunted aside, although the Water Development Board has taken the position that there are ways through the current that they could pay for water imported from out of state. But in 2023, there's really no discussion about the state water grid idea, although I think it was pretty clear in hindsight that Barry was trying to establish this Texas Water Fund and the new water supply for Texas fund in order to provide money to make it happen. Um, so why are we so concerned about this state water grid? Well, a number of reasons. As I sort of indicated before, the 1968 Texas Water Plan proposal, it's a hugely expensive proposition. And if you're talking about importation of water from out of state, that could be very unreliable as political winds change or other factors. It may be difficult to really depend upon water supplies from out of state in the future if that's part of the state water grid. I mean, look at how it's been difficult for us to get Mexico to live up to its commitments to provide water under the 1944 treaty between the United States and Mexico over the Rio Grande and the tributaries to the Rio Grande. And I could envision that type of issue coming up again with other states where we might get water from, like Arkansas, Louisiana, even if they agreed to the transfer in the first place. But also keep in mind that if you're talking about moving water around the state of Texas in a big way, um, you will have to expend a lot of energy in order to move that water. The 1968 Texas Water Plan, which would move water from Northeast Texas to the Panhandle by canal, would have required as much electric power or the electric power amount equivalent to about a third of the entire state electric, because you are moving water basically over 800 miles or so, if you include the spurs, and you're moving it uphill up to by about 3,000 feet in elevation, which requires a lot of pumping and a lot of electric power to move those pumps. I don't know exactly how much a state water grid these days would actually cost us, but to give you a possible idea, at a state Senate committee hearing held on, I believe, SB 7 this spring, I think Evgenia was probably there at the hearing. Um, the general manager of the Sabine River Authority testified that they could sell water from the Texas portion of Toledo Bend, where there is a lot of water that's not committed to anybody, for as little as $100 an acre foot of water. But the real cost would be in transporting that water to central Texas to the communities along the I-35 corridor that are growing so fast in population and are looking for desperately for water supplies. He said that the lowest cost estimate they had for moving water through two 10-foot pipelines from the Sabine River to Central Texas was about $20 billion. And that is just, one transport of water from one part of the state to another. That doesn't include, that would not be the entire cost of moving it all around the state like the 1968 Texas Water Plan. So we're probably talking well over $100 billion or so that would be required for a state water grid, even if it was worth the expenditure. And then, of course, you have the environmental considerations of the impact of pipeline construction. You have the disruption of freshwater inflows to basin estuaries, and those impacts a whole bunch of environmental considerations that, frankly, frighten me in terms of what would happen if we went forward with the state water grid. And then you really undercut or undermine the incentive for people to conserve water. If you give them the impression that Texas is going to have all the water it needs because it's importing all this water from Louisiana or Arkansas, there's no incentive for people to conserve water. Not even in a drought, they'll say, well, we've got enough water, so we don't have to worry about saving water. That can create a vicious cycle where people use more and more water, and eventually you have water demands even greater than what we have, or even greater than what is projected. So there are a lot of problems with this proposal of a state water grid. I frankly don't think that with the amounts of money being talked about the legislature this session, a $2.5 billion one-time infusion of money to the Texas Water Fund and a dedicated $1 billion a year over 10 to 16 years, that even that, although it's a lot of money, is enough to really, create a state water grid. Although Chairman Perry continues to push that idea, and the 80-20 split that Evgeny had talked about earlier is really sort of critical to that whole issue, because he feels that if you can get 80% of the money allocated to these new types of projects like seawater desalination and produced water, that gives him more of an opportunity with other provisions in the legislation to eventually create a state water grid, even if you can't do it all immediately or in the very foreseeable future. So that's why this issue is back on the front burner for me and some other people, including the Sierra Club. And one of the reasons that I dwell upon this and wanted to make this presentation tonight is that, and show you the history of all this, is that I don't think this issue is going to go away anytime soon. In fact, I think the idea of a state water grid is going to come back again and again and again over a period of years. And I want all of you to be aware of the history of it and be prepared to fight it, because frankly, people like me aren't going to be around that much longer. And so people need to be educated, informed about what the proposal is, what the whole concept is, and why it's problematic, and be prepared to oppose it in the future. So that's it. I'll be happy to answer any questions if we have time.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Ken. Grab a drink of water. I speak for everybody. That was a hell of a presentation. I learned a ton just in that little bit of time. almost 60 years, y'all, of this idea. And here we are again with more ornaments attached to the proverbial Christmas tree. So we are close to time, but we can stay on a little bit longer if there's some discussion points. I know there was a lot of comments in the chat. Go ahead and raise your hand. Use the raise hand feature, or just put your hand in front of your camera like that if you'd like to ask a question. John Tate.
Yes, thank you. So you said that one of the drawbacks to having a water grid would be reduction of flows into the bays and estuaries. And I agree that reduction of flows into the bays and estuaries is a big problem, but how exactly would the grid do that?
Well, it could do it in a number of different ways. For one thing, the construction of the grid, construction of pipelines now, I don't think we're talking about canals anymore because of evaporation, but the construction of pipelines can cross over uh, tributaries and rivers and create some problems there. But also, I think there's the idea that as you create these pipelines, you capture more and more of that water to put into the pipelines to move it around the state, which makes it less available for inflows to the bays and estuaries. Plus, most of these proposals talk about building additional reservoirs, as if you will, holding tanks for the water that would be moved, and those can disrupt the flows to freshwater or to the bays and estuaries as well as in-stream flows. That's primarily the major mechanisms.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ken. Thank you, John. Go ahead, Jason.
Hey, Ken. Thanks for the presentation. So I've been thinking about this for a while, and in order to create like a Texas water grid today, we would need like an excess amount of water somewhere, right? And I'm having a tough time imagining somewhere having excess water for long periods of time, like over the next 30 to 50 years. To me, it kind of seems like desal is the only one of the few options where you could add a significant amount of water to a grid. What are your feelings about that?
Yeah, what Chairman Perry has said, he says that we're going to need a certain amount of water by 2040, I think he says, much more than what the Texas water plan, the current Texas water plan, which is much more reasonable, projects. Because he thinks certain things, certain projects like certain reservoirs won't be built, certain things won't happen by 2040. And I think his figures keep changing a little bit, but I know that he was saying that probably by 2040, at one point, I think he said we'll probably need 7 million acre feet of new water. He's calculating that about 1.6, 1.8 million acre feet would come from out of state. I think that is probably about half from Toledo Bend or from the Louisiana portion of Toledo Bend and the rest from Arkansas. But that doesn't meet his deficit that he's projecting. So I think he really is focused a lot on seawater desalination plants built on the Texas coast and the produced water and from the Permian Basin of their oil and gas sources. And for whatever reason, he's not a fan of wastewater reuse or water reuse, however you want to term it, which a lot of people think is a very viable way of providing additional water for municipalities. He's a proponent of aquifer storage and recovery. So I think his main focus is out-of-state water importation, seawater desalination plants on the coast, and produced water.
Well, thank you.
And of course, for many of us who are not high on fossil fuels, we don't want to see produced water, as an ongoing reliable source of water. Even if you could prove that it could be used for potable water supplies or agricultural production or whatever, which I think the jury's still out. Dan Mueller's on this call. He can comment on that if he wants, but I'm not as high on produced water. I just don't think on the long term it's very viable.
Thank you, Ken. Thank you, Jason. Before we go to Annalisa, I just want to let you all know, for those of y'all in Central Texas, Wednesday morning at 10:30, we'll be doing our next legislative lit drop, where teams of volunteers and Sierra Club members and supporters go to legislative offices. We'll be dropping off one-pagers about HJR 7. So feel free to join us and shoot us a note if you'd like more information about that. Annalisa.
Yeah, when I talked to Perry's staff, he said that they oppose the wastewater recycling because it doesn't pull well. So he was mainly worried about getting this passed on the ballot when it goes up for a vote as a constitutional amendment. But, I think if we can get around that, the wastewater recycling, and also fixing our leaky water infrastructure, which is huge, considered as a source of supply, we would be a lot better off.
Yeah, let me say one thing about the water loss control or the reduction in water loss. Perry keeps making this dichotomy between new water supply or controlling water loss. And he says, yeah, I agree, we need to control water loss, but the priority should be on new water supply. And then he also downplays the amount of water that can be uh, recaptured, if you will, through water loss control. I think the other day at the Senate Finance Committee hearing, which I monitored online, he said that constituted only like 3% of Texas water or something like that. Now, I take it that what he's saying is that if you look at the entire water consumption in the state, including irrigated agriculture, industrial, mining, and municipal, that the water loss in municipalities or rural water utilities only amounts to about 3% of the total, which may or may not be right. But if you're talking about the water in cities and retail and wholesale water utilities, it can be anywhere in excess of 15 or 20%. I think as in San Antonio, I think it's around 17% and water loss annually. So we're talking about some significant amount of water being lost. And he's not saying that he opposes water loss control, but under his 80-20 split proposal as it stands now, water loss control is not considered new water supply. So it would be among the different competing interests for that 20%, which would include flood control, flood management, as well as wastewater treatment. So I think that he does not give adequate attention to how much water we could save through reducing our loss of water in municipal distribution lines.
So I was muted. Indeed. Thank you, Ken. Last comment and question here from Roy Whaley, please.
Thank you, Ken. Good to hear from you.
Hey, Roy.
Yes. Anyway, what can you tell us about aquifer storage and recovery? That's what we're talking about here in Austin. It's sending water out to Bastrop County, probably the Carrizo, Wilcox, finding a perched aquifer. Do you have any tells about successful aquifer storage and recovery?
Well, I guess the best success story is San Antonio Water System. They have the ability to take a certain amount of water out of the Edwards Aquifer when the aquifer is above a particular level, and when they don't need that much water. And then they have stored it in an aquifer downstream of San Antonio. I believe it's the Carrizo also. And then they're able to draw it out in times when their water is more short. And as best I can tell, I visited their facility right before it went in operation, but as best I can tell, I think that operates fairly successfully. Now, I think with aquifer storage and recovery, ASR as it's known, the devil is always in the details about where you take the water from, where you inject it, what the quality of the water is before you inject it. El Paso, of course, does this kind of thing as well. The San Antonio water system has the advantage that the water they take from the Edwards is very high quality water in the first place. And so there's not really an issue in terms of the quality of the water being injected. in aquifer downstream of San Antonio. In other places, there might be issues with, for example, taking treated wastewater and injecting it into an aquifer for later recovery, because you may not be totally clear about the level to which it has been cleaned before it goes into the aquifer. Of course, aquifers can sometimes provide a cleansing effect themselves. So, it's really difficult to make a general statement about any particular ASR project, but I would assert that there are successful ASR projects, and that's a legitimate water supply option to be looked at as long as all these other factors are carefully considered.
Thank you so much, Ken. We had a great discussion right now this evening, and thank you so much for staying longer. Tomorrow
Yeah.
I will send out the follow-up email with the resources that were shared today, including the links, including the presentation as well. I saw that Ken, the map you shared generated some interest. Some people wanted probably to look at it in more detail, so I'll share the slides. You'll have access to that. And yeah, thank you so much for the great presentation. And the water grid, that's an interesting proposal. And one of my first conversations with Ken when I met Ken for the first time a few months ago was about the history of the water grid, and it was fascinating conversation. Every time I hear about it from you, Ken, I learn something new. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so we will stay in touch and expect to hear from me tomorrow in your email.